Reading the Times for Thursday, January 29th, 2020. Trump's defense team discounts Bolton as Republicans work to hold off witnesses. On the final day of arguments on Mr. Trump's behalf, Jay Sekulow, one of the president's private lawyers, sought to raise doubts about Mr. Bolton's claim in an unpublished manuscript that Mr. Trump tied the release of military aid to Ukraine to investigations into his political rivals, calling it an unsourced allegation that was inadmissible in his impeachment trial. Just after Mr. Trump's team ended a 3-day legal defense, Republican senators rushed into a private meeting room in the Capitol, where Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, the majority leader, worked to herd his rank and file in line behind ending the trial without witnesses. The longtime Republican foreign policy figure has made clear that he would testify if called, but senators also know that regardless of his account, there's almost no chance that the Republican-controlled chamber would vote to convict Mr. Trump and remove him from office less than 10 months before a presidential election. For John Bolton, an upside-down world after Trump revelation. If John Bolton says that in the book, I believe John. If John Bolton says that in the book, I believe John Bolton, Mr. Kelly said during a lecture in Sarasota, Florida. According to a report in the Herald Tribune, Mr. Kelly said Mr. Bolton always gave the president the unvarnished truth, adding, "John's an honest guy. He's a man of integrity and great character." So we'll see that happens. We'll see what happens. That it has come to this surprise, no one who actually. It has come to this, surprises no one who actually knows Mr. Bolton. The president denied Mr. Bolton's version of events when his personal lawyer, Rudolph W. Giuliani, called the former advisor a backstabber. On the Fox Business Channel, Lou Dobbs assailed Mr. Bolton as a tool of the president's enemies, citing as proof the fact that he used the same literary agents as James B. Comey, the FBI director fired by Mr. Trump, prompting one of the literary agents to point out that one of their other clients was Mr. Dobbs. Trump releases Mideast peace plan that strongly favors Israel. President Trump on Tuesday unveiled his long-awaited Middle East peace plan with a flourish, releasing a proposal that would give Israel most of what it has sought over decades of conflict, while offering the Palestinians the possibility of a state with limited sovereignty. The White House called it a demilitarized Palestinian state, with Israel retaining security responsibility west of the Jordan River, although over time, the Palestinians would assume more control of that responsibility. A White House official said Mr. Trump's proposed $50 billion economic plan for the new Palestinian state would create over 1 million new jobs over 10 years, double the size of the Palestinian economy, cut poverty in half, and reduce unemployment to below 10%. A deal that has 2 elections rather than Mideast peace as its focus. Mr. Trump now enters the heart of his election campaign, declaring that he has delivered a plan that makes Jerusalem the undivided capital of Israel and relegates the Palestinian capital to a suburb, and one that Mr. Trump, in triumph of real estate branding, is suddenly calling East Jerusalem. The timing is no accident. At the moment when cable television is focused on impeachment, and the prospect that the former National Security Advisor, John R. Bolton, may testify, Mr. Trump has a chance to stay in the East Room and cast himself as a peacemaker. Mr. Trump's 180-page plan would require the Palestinians to accept only partial sovereignty over a future Palestinian state, at least for a considerable time, and give up any claim to territory where the Israelis have already accepted settlements. Whereas the Israelis have already accepted settlements. In the meantime, Israel would free settlements in the territory that Mr. Trump has set aside for the Palestinians, much of it areas the Israelis have little interest in. How people of color inside the Buttigieg campaign sought to be heard. Not in 2008 and never in 2016, Robbie Mook, who managed Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign, said campaigns were becoming more open to hearing from junior staff members whose concerns in the past may have been largely ignored by top officials. In a lot of different places on the campaign, we kind of have to screw up big time before we make any big changes. In a statement provided by the campaign, Ms. Smith said, even as a more junior member of my team, my voice is fully heard and valued. Mr. Meager, the campaign spokesman, attributed the Patton episode to a communications breakdown. Marcus Schweitzer, an official in the Buddy Gig fundraising department, said he had subsequently helped improve the process of vetting donors. The campaign's policy director, who helped organize the Building Belonging sessions, said the young staff members of color had long been asking for an open discussion of issues of diversity on the campaign. A divided Hong Kong confronts the arrival of the coronavirus. The government in Beijing will also stop issuing visas for individual travelers to Hong Kong from the mainland. The prospect of a new avenue for criticism of Hong Kong's government after months of simmering conflict with protesters has caused alarm among officials as they are trying to appear responsive to the coronavirus outbreak. Ms. Wong said she was shocked to learn from a news conference on Saturday that the Hong Kong government has identified the unoccupied public housing complex in Fanling as a possible quarantine site for the relatives of infected people. Kenya's new digital IDs may exclude millions of minorities. There's a real risk, said Karen Weitzberg, a researcher at University College London who's studying the biometric program in Kenya, that the IDs will only reproduce existing inequalities and exacerbate debates over who is really a Kenyan. Kenya is a diverse country with a history of tensions between ethnic groups. The Kenyan government has long made it harder, or even impossible, for members of some ethnic groups, among them Nubians, Somalis, Maasais, Boranas, Indians, and Arabs, to apply for the documents required for national ID cards. Idemia, the French firm that won the contract to supply Kenya's biometric kits, was already embroiled in controversy for its work on Kenya's 2017 elections and was sanctioned by Parliament last year, a move Idemia is challenging in court. Containing the coronavirus, countries limit travel to China. The new travel restrictions put a deeper freeze on China's contact with the world, cutting off business and tourism as China's economy faces a potential slowdown. The economic impact of such measures pointed to a deeper political crisis, with many people accusing the Chinese authorities online of failing to act quickly to contain the virus, even as the government continues to struggle to control its spread. The travel advisories and bans came as the virus showed early signs of spreading outside China, with cases of transmission to people who had not recently traveled to China reported in Japan, Germany, and Vietnam. Bloomberg told its employees in Hong Kong and mainland China to work remotely until further notice, and it restricted travel to China and Hong Kong over the next 30 days, according to an email seen by the New York Times. Researchers are racing to make a coronavirus vaccine. Will it help? Dr. Barney Graham, Deputy Director of the Vaccine Research Center at the NIH, urged government scientists in China to share the genetic makeup of the virus so his team could begin its race to develop a vaccine. The vaccines never made it to market because SARS was successfully contained with public health measures before the vaccine was ready, and preliminary human trials for the MERS vaccine showed successful last year. We don't know which vaccine approach will be successful at this stage, so we have to try everything in our arsenal, said Dr. Gregory Poland, a vaccine expert at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. In interviews, company executives said that partnerships with government and philanthropic foundations were essential to developing vaccines for outbreaks because there are so many uncertainties. How do bats live with so many viruses? Dr. Peter Daszak, president of EcoHealth Alliance, who has been working in China for 15 years studying diseases that jump from animals to people, said, "We don't know the source yet, but there's pretty strong evidence that this is a bat origin coronavirus." He said, "It's probably going to be the Chinese horseshoe bat, a common species that weighs up to an ounce. People in many parts of the world eat bats and sell them in live animal markets, which was the source of SARS and possibly the latest coronavirus outbreak that began in Wuhan While the bats must be studied, their physiology understood, and the virus is a harbor monitored for the sake of public health, that does not mean that the bats are to blame for the outbreak. China will admit international experts to help contain coronavirus outbreak. After repeatedly declining assistance from international health officials, Chinese authorities agreed on Tuesday to permit teams of experts coordinated by the World Health Organization to visit China to help contain the growing coronavirus outbreak. The Chinese authorities agreed to work with experts from other countries after a meeting between President Xi Jinping and Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, Director General of the WHO. The WHO praised China's response to the outbreak, including its rapid identification of the virus and its openness to sharing information with WHO and other countries. Though the outbreak is continuing in China, federal officials maintain that the risk of infection remains low in the United States. An epidemic is not driven by asymptomatic carriers. There was no evidence that people were contagious before they showed symptoms during outbreaks of other coronavirus disease like SARS and MERS, which might suggest that such transmission is unlikely with the new coronavirus. Harry and Meghan's big funding source is private, sort of. The duchy's holding reflects how royal family's wealth has become concentrated in the hands of Prince Charles and his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, whose own estate, the Duchy of Lancaster, paid her £21.7 million last year. The Duchy of Cornwall looks and behaves like a corporation, but the Duchy does not pay taxes like a corporation. The Duchy said the prince pays rent at market value to avoid the Duchy taking on costs it shouldn't. Ex-King of Belgium acknowledges a long-dismissed daughter. Rumors of an illegitimate child were first alluded to in a 1990 book about Queen Paola by a journalist, Mario Daniels, and Miss Boel made her first public claim that King Albert was her father in a 2005 interview. While King Albert has never explicitly denied Miss Boel's claim, he refused to acknowledge it, and Miss Boel filed a lawsuit seeking recognition as his biological daughter in 2013. Albert's elder brother, King Baudouin, died suddenly of heart failure in 1993, leaving no children, meaning Albert became king. Johnson risks a rift with Trump by granting new access to Huawei. On Tuesday, Mr. Johnson was confronted with a stark choice in deciding to give the Chinese telecommunications giant Huawei limited access to Britain's new high-speed broadband network. He broke abruptly with the president, who once praised him as a really good man and a British version of himself. During the Cold War, Margaret Thatcher never contracted with the K.G.B. to save a few pennies. The debate over Huawei divided Mr. Johnson's cabinet and conservative parties. Critics warned that the Britain's plan to limit the use of the company's gear were unrealistic and would leave it vulnerable to Chinese intelligence. Tom Tugendhat, a conservative member of the parliament who had urged Mr. Johnson to bar Huawei, said on Tuesday that the plan leaves many concerns and does not close the UK's network to a frequently maligned international actor. British officials said they were left with little choice but to approve Huawei because of the lack of alternative providers. Samsung is not a competitor in Britain, as is the United States, and the fact that Huawei is a well-established player in the British network, which means that if barred the company, it would potentially have to rip Huawei gear out of the existing 4G network. Officials recover remains of a U.S. military plane crash site in Afghanistan. 2 sets of remains have been recovered at the site where an American military plane crashed in Taliban-controlled territory outside Kabul, Afghanistan on Monday, American military officials said, after a day in which United States forces struggled to get to the site. American officials had indicated on Monday that they thought the 2-person crew of the plane had most likely not survived the crash, which occurred in the district of Dayak in Ghazni province during a day of harsh weather. The country's vice president, Sarwar Danish, who said it had been a passenger plane, had even expressed condolence over the martyrdom to the people of Afghanistan. Further confusion of the situation, reports in Iranian news and social media framed the crash as a retaliation for the death of Major General Qasem Soleimani, the powerful Iranian commander killed in an American drone strike in Baghdad. Iranian news media reported when reports went as far as identifying a CIA official they said had been killed in the plane, who they said was shot down. Russia experts growing influence in Africa, worrying many in the West. Nearly 200 Russian mercenaries had deployed in recent months to Mozambique to combat a growing Islamic State offshoot there, even as Moscow is taking initial steps toward building a military port in the Horn of Africa that could become Russia's first permanent base on the continent. About 1,500 miles south, down the eastern coast of Africa, Russian military transport planes landed last summer in Cabo Delgado province in northern Mozambique and, according to American officials, deployed about 160 personnel belonging to the Wagner Group, a Russian private military contractor. Russian military engagement and use of private military contractors in Mozambique is designed to increase Russian influence in southern Africa and to enable Russian access to Mozambique's natural resources, including gas, coal, and oil. Rear Admiral. A muted Arab response to Trump's Mideast peace plan. In unveiling his peace plan Tuesday for solving the conflict between Israel and Palestinians, President Trump confidently declared that Arab countries would play a key role in its success. While 3 Arab ambassadors from Oman, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates were present at the announcement, Mr. Trump said there were no Palestinians. From the miserable 1917 Balfour Declaration to the farcical 2020 Trump Declaration, and Arab leaders are either useless or cheering. Nabil Fahmy, a former foreign minister of Egypt, said he feared that Mr. Trump's proposal would not only fail to bring peace to the region, but that it might also scupper the chances of a lasting deal. Scupper is a good word. I'm gonna look that up just in case you don't know what it means. Scupper means a hole in a ship's side to carry water overboard from the deck, an outlet in the side of a building for draining water. As a verb, it's a noun though. Scuttle, did they mean? The scupper is a noun. Scupper verb. To make a ship sink by deliberately letting water in. Okay. It may scupper the chances. I mean, was that really necessary though? Who wrote this? Ben Hubbard, Declan Walsh, really? Trump's plan first result, Israel will claim sovereignty over part of the West Bank. Mr. Netanyahu's actions were explicitly blessed by President Trump on Tuesday when he promised to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the territory that my vision provides to be part of the state of Israel. Standing by Mr. Trump at the White House, Mr. Netanyahu commended him for recognizing Israel's need for a buffer along the Jordan River, giving it strategic depth against allies to the east, with the ability to prevent the smuggling of weapons to the Palestinians, while the Israeli response to previous American proposals has traditionally been yes, along with reservations. Israelis say Palestinian response has either been negative or non-existent, with the Palestinian missing in action, according to Dor Gold, a longtime Netanyahu advisor, who said he had also been consulted by the Trump team. The plan is a kind of declaration that the old paradigm had failed and that something new is needed. Yaakov Amidror, a former Israeli national security advisor, said Israelis would prefer a bilaterally negotiated agreement. Netanyahu withdraws immunity bid, shifting election battleground. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has withdrawn his request for immunity from prosecution on corruption charges. He said Tuesday morning, complaining that he would not have gotten a fair shake from Parliament and had therefore decided not to let the dirty game continue. The move, which was not unexpected, ensures that Mr. Netanyahu, who is running for in Israel's third election in a year after the first two ended in deadlock, will have to campaign as a defendant in a criminal case heading into the March 2nd ballot. We must move forward. The citizens of Israel face a clear choice: a prime minister who will work for them, or a prime minister who is busy with himself. No one can manage a state and at the same time manage 3 serious criminal cases. By withdrawing the immunity request, Mr. Netanyahu will also be easing tensions within his own conservative Likud party. The Israeli news outlet reported in recent days that a growing number of Likud lawmakers were urging Mr. Netanyahu to give up immunity, so the criminal craze would not dominate the campaign. When your best surrogate can't talk. If you can't take care of a dog, and dogs like you, if you can take care of a dog, and dogs like you, it says a lot about your character. But while Bailey is flesh and blood participant in campaign events, the Buttigieg pets, Truman and Buddy, are mainly virtual ones, at least so far. As for the dog's part in the campaign, the dogs primarily serve in the important role of South Bend representatives for the campaign while Pete and Chasen are on the road. She said, in contrast to the Buttigieg's dog's Twitter account, which is managed by humans, as if they're actually dogs who can't speak English and don't understand what Twitter is. Mr. Aber said, I took an approach that Warren is an intellectual who's running this aggressive campaign focused on issues like corruption. In Mr. Aber's rendering, Bailey reflects his owner's politics. U.S. accuses Harvard scientist of concealing Chinese funding. China's communist government's goal, simply put, is to replace the U.S. as the world superpower, and they are breaking the law to get there. He called Massachusetts, with its cluster of elite universities and research institutions, a target-rich environment. Charging documents in the case describe Mr. Leiber's growing commitments in China and efforts to hide them from his employers in the United States. Dr. Leiber told them he was aware of China's 1,000 Talents program but had never been invited to participate, prosecution documents say. 2 days after that conversation, the documents say Dr. Leiber asked a laboratory associate to help him identify web pages in which he was named as the head of the Chinese lab. A primary from the right, not in Trump's GOP. The President Trump is going to win in 2020, Mr. Meehan, a 55-year-old financial advisor, told his audience, because Andy would be a real ally in the president's second term. But while the terms dictating Republican primaries may be simpler than ever, so is the president's logic on whether to meddle in them, which means a 2020 primary season, rather than usher in a small new class of Trump diehards, could instead leave behind a slate of former candidates whose downfall was demanding more loyalty to the president than the president demanded for himself. With senators stuck in Washington, surrogates get starring role in Iowa. To be very honest with you, a month ago, a couple weeks ago, I would not have told you I would be spending the last week of the campaign in Washington, D.C. Mr. Sanders said at a stop in Perry on Sunday, during a frenzied Iowa swing between impeachment trial sessions. Mr. Castro, who along with his twin brother, Representative Joaquin Castro, campaigned for Miss Warren in Iowa last week, said he had met a lot of people that I didn't necessarily get to meet when I was running. He acknowledged that some of the people who came to hear him speak would have preferred to see Miss Warren there too. Jonathan Van Ness, a host of Queer Eye, campaigned for Miss Warren in Iowa City, then joined her for selfies at the town hall in Cedar Rapids. Biden aides weigh pursuing an Iowa caucus alliance with Klobuchar. The Biden officials, led by the campaign's Iowa director, Jake Braun, asked the Klobuchar strategist, Peter Guillen Greco, about the prospect that the two campaigns could encourage their supporters in the state to back the other candidate in precincts where Mr. Biden or Ms. Klobuchar fall short of the 15% threshold required to reach the second round of balloting. For weeks, supporters of Mr. Biden had expressed hope that they can win Iowa if the bulk of Ms. Klobuchar supporters migrate to him on the second ballot. In an interview Sunday, former Governor Tom Vilsack of Iowa, a top Biden supporter, made the case on why supporters should rally to Mr. Biden and even suggested Ms. Klobuchar might be considered as his running mate. Pro-Israel Democratic Super PAC to air attack ads against Bernie Sanders. A Democratic Super PAC will begin airing attack ads in Iowa against Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont on Wednesday, marking the first time a Democratic organization has run a negative campaign spot targeting Mr. Sanders by name in either of his two primary campaigns. On Tuesday, Third Way, a centrist think tank, sent an email to several hundred of its supporters in Iowa, encouraging them to highlight positions taken by Mr. Sanders that the group argues will repel swing voters in battleground states. Mark Mellman, the president of Democratic Majority for Israel and a longtime Democratic pollster, said his group began developing an ad several weeks ago as Mr. Sanders rebounded from a slide in the polls last fall. The buy is heavily weighted toward Cedar Rapids and Des Moines markets, and the group is also airing an ad on cable, including on CNN, MSNBC, and ESPN. News that the group had made reservations was swirling around Democratic circles on Tuesday morning, and the Sanders campaign sent a fundraising text message to supporters warning an outside group is starting a $700,000 negative ad campaign against Bernie. The text asked for $2.70 to help push back. At rally, Trump praises Van Drew for leaving deranged Democratic Party. Mr. Van Drew had also been a strong anti-impeachment voice in the House before he made the switch, saying the Republican Party was a better fit. Mr. Van Drew said he had requested a rally when Mr. Trump asked how he could help. They're trying to steal that election, Mr. Trump said, and Jeff has the guts to defy the left-wing fanatics in his own party and to stand tall in defense of our Constitution, our freedom, and democracy itself. At the rally, Mr. Van Drew was immediately embraced by Trump supporters as one of their own. Mr. Trump lost New Jersey by 14 points to Hillary Clinton, his Democratic challenger, in 2016. But the rally drew thousands who hoped to change the political fortunes for local Republicans, starting with Mr. Van Drew's election. Joni Ernst asked if impeachment trial will turn Iowa caucus goers against Biden. They answer. Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa, a Republican, wondered aloud about her Democratic constituents as they wrestled with a final decision before the looming Iowa caucuses, particularly those considering supporting former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr. After sitting through hours of arguments in the impeachment trial of President Trump on Monday, where his legal team focused on how Mr. Biden's son, Hunter, had nabbed a lucrative position on the board of a Ukrainian energy company, Ms. Ernst addressed reporters in the basement of the Capitol. Oh, sister, are you sure? Are you sure you want to be the face of this? As for Mr. Biden, she said Mr. Trump's attacks had both accentuated the Biden campaign's argument that the president's worries are about facing him in a general election and offered a clear preview of how the president would attack him. The President's Council showcased that the Bidens were knee-deep in corruption. Corruption isn't good politics, and it's not good for the American people. As the impeachment proceedings have ramped up, Mr. Biden has been hammering the argument that he is the candidate Trump fears most. Trump's NJ rally, frigid wait, is worth it for President's fans. A carnival atmosphere filled the boardwalk nearby as supporters of Mr. Trump mingled near a block-long corridor of T-shirts and button vendors. 4 more years, Mr. Trump's supporters shouted. Mr. Tartamosa said that he hoped the event would instill in his son some of Mr. Trump's conservative views. Police officer charged with murder and killing of handcuffed suspect in Maryland. There's no reason why a handcuffed person should ever be shot multiple times by a police officer, let alone shot multiple times inside a patrol car. Deborah Jean, the legal director of the ACLU of Maryland, said in a statement on Tuesday, the president of Lodge 89 of the Fraternal Order of Police, which represents Prince George County's officers, did not immediately respond to a request for comments on Tuesday night. In 2011, the department placed Corporal Owen, an officer at the time, on administrative leave after he shot and killed a Landover, Maryland man whom the police said had pointed a gun at him. Framing the impeachment case, an inside look at opposing legal teams. The seven House Democratic impeachment managers, handpicked by Speaker Nancy Pelosi of California, have argued that President Trump abused his power by pressuring Ukraine to help smear his political rivals and obstructed Congress to conceal his actions. Mr. Trump's defense team, drawn from the White House counsel's office and outside lawyers, including a few who frequently appear on television, have argued that the president did nothing wrong and accused Democrats of using impeachment as a tool to remove an opponent they could not defeat at the ballot box. We live in a constitutional republic where you have deep policy concerns and deep differences. That should not be the basement of an impeachment. Jay Sekulow, the president's personal lawyer. They're asking you to tear up all of it, all of the ballots across the country on your own initiative. Take that decision away from the American people. Pat A. Cipollone, the White House counsel, Mr. Cipollone and Mr. Sekulow have been the president's most frequent defenders on the Senate floor, providing most of the arguments against the Democratic effort to vote on subpoenas for documents and witnesses ahead of their team's arguments. Impeachment enters volatile new phase as senators get to ask their questions. Under the rules, senators cannot ask each other questions, but a question can be submitted by more than one lawmaker. In one of the worst moments for the House Republican managers seeking Mr. Clinton's ouster, Representative Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, now senator participating in Mr. Trump's trial, answered a question by saying that reasonable people can differ on the question of whether Mr. Clinton should be removed, giving Democrats a much-needed excuse to acquit him. In addition to the whistleblower and Mr. Biden, Mr. Hawley said he will ask a series of good questions about former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., Senator Christopher S. Murphy, a Democrat of Connecticut, told reporters last week it would be good if we had some joint questions where a Democratic and Republican senator both signed their names on a single question. On the day Democrats vote in Iowa, Trump plans to flood the zone. The surrogates will include two former presidential candidates who once campaigned against Mr. Trump in Iowa, Housing Secretary Ben Carson and Rick Perry, the former Energy Secretary. A group of Trump loyalists from the House, including Representatives Elise Stefanik of New York, Jim Jordan of Ohio, Mark Meadows of North Carolina, and Matt Gaetz of Florida, will also be on the ground to make their case for Mr. Trump, the campaign announced Tuesday. Strategically, it's important for Trump surrogates to be in Iowa to consume some of the media coverage, said David Bossie, who was Mr. Trump's deputy campaign manager in 2016 and plans to participate in the Iowa offensive. For Senator Kelly Loeffler, impeachment is an early proving ground. It's time to move on. The attack on Mr. Romney in 2012, Republican presidential nominee who Mr. Trump has berated as a pompous ass and a fool, reflected how Ms. Loeffler, who arrived on Capitol Hill just in time for the third Senate presidential impeachment trial in history, is managing her new role as she faces intense political headwinds of her own. His candidacy, which has long been rumored, helped to explain why Ms. Loeffler, who was appointed over Mr. Trump's explicit objections, he preferred Ms. Collins for the job, raced to broadcast her support for the president in the impeachment fight. Mr. Collins has been one of the president's most vociferous defenders. That puts Senator Loeffler in a position on vocally demonstrating that she has the president's back in the impeachment debate. Sworn in days after Mr. Trump authorized the drone strikes that killed Major General Qasem Soleimani, Iran's top security commander, Ms. Loeffler began work as the country found itself on the edge of war, on the brink of the historic impeachment trial. How impeachment puts Doug Jones in a no-win situation in Alabama. As for how he thought Mr. Jones would handle his vote on Mr. Trump's impeachment trial, Mr. Woods said he's well aware of his surroundings. Mr. Woods said he did not see himself voting for Mr. Jones in November, given that Republicans were likely to nominate someone more mainstream than Mr. Moore. If faced with a choice between two Senate candidates who voted to acquit Mr. Trump, she said forlornly, "What am I going to do?" before answering her own question. I wouldn't vote. Noting that her native country of Brazil, people were punished for not voting, she said that her conscience would lead her to exercise a freedom she did not have there. One of the women, who typically votes Republican, said she had voted for Mr. Jones in the last election, but would not do so again. Bolton book puts new focus on Trump's action in Turkey and China cases. Mr. Erdogan's influence campaign is now under scrutiny again in Washington following the disclosure that Mr. Trump's former national security advisor, John R. Bolton, reported in his forthcoming book his concern that the president was effectively granting personal favors to Mr. Erdogan and President Xi Jinping of China. Every member of Congress should be profoundly alarmed that Donald Trump is trying to get the bank accused of the largest Iranian sanctions violation scheme in U.S. history off the hook because his authoritarian pal asked for a favor. Mr. Trump's 2018 intervention in the case of ZTE was equally perplexing to some observers. The Trump family had for years worked on plans to build a series of new hotel apartment building projects in China, goals put on hold after Mr. Trump was elected president. Chains, shackles, and threats. Testimony on torture takes a dramatic turn. Mr. Nevin responded to Dr. Mitchell's account by reading from a CIA cable that described Mr. Mohammed letting out a whimper, whine, and moan as guards led him to the waterboard. The tone changed dramatically on Monday when Dr. Mitchell testified that he threatened to kill one of Mr. Mohammed's sons if there was another attack on America. Mr. Mohammed appeared impassive throughout the testimony, occasionally fingering his long orange-dyed beard while his lawyers questioned Dr. Mitchell. Day 7 of Trump's trial, the defense rests. Danger, danger, danger. To lower the bar of impeachment based on these articles of impeachment would impact the functioning of our constitutional republic and the framework of the Constitution for generations, so warned Jay Sekulow, President Trump's personal lawyer, in the defense's last days of its opening arguments in the Senate's impeachment trial. Is the Senate really going to have removal of a duly elected president based on policy disagreement? He asked, as though that's what the trial is about, rather than about the president's hijacking American foreign policy for his personal political gain. Citing the month-long delays as by Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, in transmitting the articles of impeachment to the Senate in an attempt to press that chamber to call witnesses, he intoned, "Danger, danger, danger. That's politics." We feel you, counselor. John Bolton gets the last laugh. President Trump's reaction to the leak of incriminating details in John Bolton's forthcoming book shocked me. Bolton is the impeachment star of the week, whether he winds up testifying or not, and I can't shake the feeling that he plotted all this out, keeping his head down during the hearings in the House, letting it be known only afterward that he'd be willing to testify in the Senate. The revelation this week, simultaneous with assertions by Trump's defense team that there were no first-hand witnesses to the president's wrongdoing, that his book indeed addresses Ukraine and fully backs up the charges in the articles of impeachment. According to the Times scoop about Bolton's book, he writes that Pompeo, too, was aware of the Ukraine pressure campaign, the same Pompeo who did nothing to stop the vilification of Mary Yovanovitch, the same Pompeo who promoted the debunked conspiracy theory that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election, the same Pompeo who once warned that Trump would be an authoritarian president who ignored our Constitution. And then, when Trump gave him a really neat job, decided that a little authoritarianism never hurt anyone. Is Trump Bibi's chump? Given the timing of the release on Tuesday of President Trump's Middle East peace plan, I have to begin by asking, is this plan about two states for two peoples, or is it about one diversion for two dirty leaders? Sure feels like the latter. Netanyahu already announced that with Trump's blessing, Israel will quickly move to apply its law to the West Bank's Jordan Valley and all Jewish settlements in the occupied territory. At the same time, while I understand why Palestinian leaders are denouncing this plan, they should nevertheless try to make some lemonade out of these Trump lemons. Pompeo called me a liar. That's not what bothered me. The foreign minister and I ended with an tense exchange on what is an uncomfortable question for him: the statues of United States citizens imprisoned in Iran, the status of United States citizens imprisoned in Iran, and whether future prisoner exchanges were off the table. Is there any serious initiative underway to reopen diplomacy with Iran? We've been engaged in deep diplomatic efforts since the first day of the Trump administration, Mr. Pompeo replied, underlying American efforts to build a coalition to counter and contain Iran. In terms of American engagement with Iran, I went on, are there any plans for talks? The diplomatic effort on this front has been vigorous, robust, and enormously successful, Mr. Pompeo said, changing the subject back to engaging American allies to put pressure on Iran. How to avoid the coronavirus? Wash your hands. On one long flight, at the height of the outbreak, on which my fellow passengers were mostly epidemiologists trying to solve the SARS puzzle, many of us wore our masks for the first couple of hours on the flight. In time during the SARS outbreak, the government shut down theaters and schools in Beijing, as doing now in many Chinese cities because these viruses are more easily transmitted in such crowded places. The International School of Beijing, where my children were students, where my own kids went there, was one of the few in the capital, perhaps the only one, that stayed open throughout the SARS outbreak, though the classes were emptier since so many kids had departed to their home countries. Latin America's radical feminism is spreading. Part of the choreography includes squatting down, hands behind the head, a common search procedure still performed in many Latin American countries. Police officers and prison wardens often force women, sometimes even children, to squat naked in order to do a body cavity search. The activists wear a black lace blindfold as a symbol that the often invisible ways that women are made vulnerable, but also as a nod to the hundreds of protesters who were partly blinded by the Chilean police in the past 3 months. "The rapist is you," the woman repeated here and everywhere, either pointing to a courthouse, to a police headquarters, or to the presidential palace. Anyone but Trump and Warren or Sanders? What a stunningly tone-deaf line. Yet for the overwhelming majority of Americans, life is pretty much the same under Trump as it was under Obama. I'm not a person of color, but I'm pretty sure life doesn't feel the same under a president who encourages white supremacists and speaks of people of color as criminals, gang members, and invaders. Brett Stephens makes an understandable plea for Democrats if they really want to topple President Trump in the 2020 election to choose a candidate who is center-left, say Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg or Amy Klobuchar, rather than someone on the far left like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. Just the fact that Mr. Stephens mentions these ideas, which would have been absurd under any other president, indicates that these are real possibilities if Mr. Trump wins a second term. Will there be witnesses awaiting a Senate vote? Where are those others who reportedly have contempt for President Trump? Could Mr. Trump and Mitch McConnell inflict damage on, say, 20 more senators? There's an Ethiopian proverb that states, "When spiders unite, they can take down a lion." When spiders unite, they can take down a lion. Chief Justice John Roberts called... Here, hold on. I should stop doing this. Ethiopian accent. No, I'm not going to learn it in this video. If Chief Justice John Roberts can call witnesses in the impeachment trial rather than calling John Bolton, why not call Donald Trump to the witness stand? The New York City Police Commissioner, Dermot Shea, has joined the chorus of people stoking fear about recent reforms that correct our unjust money bail system. For decades, the police department's broken windows policy tactics have funneled hundreds of thousands of innocent people, particularly young men of color, into the criminal legal system. Like the commissioner, we want New Yorkers to thrive and feel safe. There are glowing seesaws in Midtown, and New Yorkers are losing it. Ranging in length from 16 to 24 feet each, from 16 to 24 feet, each of the seesaws glow from LED augmentation and emit musical sequences as riders bounce up and down. Ariana Rosario, 26, said she was walking along Broadway with her friend Nikita Nelson and Stephanie Conteno when she spotted the dazzling lights of the seesaws and the ecstatic sounds of the riders. While riding the seesaw with Mrs. Nelson, 24, Miss Rosario lost her balance and fell to the pavement below on Broadway. Fotis Dulos, charged with killing his wife, Jennifer, attempts suicide. The police began to investigate the disappearance of Miss Dulos after she missed several appointments in New York City and multiple text messages and calls went unanswered. At least one black garbage bag had traces of Miss Dulos and Miss Traconis' DNA. The police also found 4 zip ties with Miss Dulos' DNA, 2 of which were stained with her blood, that they said Mr. Dulos had used to restrain Miss Dulos. On January 7th, nearly 8 months after Miss Dulos disappeared, officials arrested Mr. Dulos and accused him of killing her. Barr, targeting anti-Semitic crimes, enters bail reform fray. In the months since New York enacted a sweeping series of changes to its bail laws that have set thousands of defendants free pending their trial, many law enforcement officials have urged lawmakers to reconsider the law. Opponents have seized on defendants recently released under the new bail laws who were rearrested on suspicion of committing new crimes, including several anti-Semitic incidents. As for the bail changes, many who have criticized them have also asked lawmakers to give judges some discretion in seeking bail in cases where defendants pose a perceived risk to the public. For 25 years in prison, he said he was innocent. A judge just agreed. Mr. Ruiz's lawyer sought to keep the identification of him from being used as evidence, but it was allowed to stand, court papers said, and Mr. Ruiz was indicted. At his trial, prosecutors from the Manhattan District Office relied mostly on the victim's testimony and her initial identification of Mr. Ruiz as one of her attackers. Mr. Tendi believed the victim had accidentally led the police to the wrong apartment and then mistakenly put them onto Mr. Ruiz's trail. Britain defies Trump plea to ban Huawei from 5G network. Huawei is reassured by the UK government's confirmation that we can continue working with our customers to keep the 5G rollout on track. Victor Zhang, Huawei's vice president, said in a statement, in 2018, Australia imposed a ban on Huawei gear, and Japan put restrictions on purchasing Huawei equipment for government use. Even with the British decision, American critics of Huawei say the United States could still slow Huawei's march by blocking American firms from providing needed chips or by helping rivals. How Under Armour lost its edge. A spokeswoman for Under Armour, when asked about the events, said Mr. Curry had been a fantastic partner over the past 7 years and that the company was excited about our future partnership plans. In its promise and its turmoil, Under Armour's relationship with Mr. Curry encapsulates the company's broader struggles in recent years and represents a critical piece of its comeback hopes. In a statement, a spokeswoman said the company was proud of the global brand that it continued to build, adding, like the athletes we serve, we are acutely aware of our strengths and weaknesses and the opportunities that are inherent every time we train, compete, and recover. From its early days, Under Armour made its mark as a tech-focused sport apparel company. With Under Armour stock soaring in the fall of 2015, Mr. Plank and his top lieutenants believed nothing could stop the company's rise. Coronavirus exposes cracks in China's facade of unity. Staff members at prestigious Union Hospital in Wuhan, the city at the center of the outbreak, have joined others around China in begging online for medical supplies. The coronavirus outbreak has already killed over 100 people and infected more than 4,000 in China, mostly in Wuhan and elsewhere in Hubei. After Premier Li Keqiang visited Wuhan on Monday, a week after the epidemic became a full-blown crisis, a retiree told my colleague Chris Buckley, in China, if a leader visits, that shows that all the resources of the government can be mobilized. Li Haipeng, a former journalist, predicted as early as last week that eventually the state would come to Wuhan's rescue. How the Fed chairman is shielding it from Mr. Trump. To underline the Fed's independence, he ignores presidential heckling even when it's personal. Mr. Trump has referred to Fed policymakers as boneheads, and he likened Mr. Powell himself to a golfer who can't putt. And to shore up support, Mr. Powell visits Capitol Hill frequently, holding more than 260 meetings with members of Congress since taking over as a chair February 2018. Mr. Powell listens carefully to lawmakers' concerns and explains clearly what the Fed is doing, said Senator Patrick J. Toomey, a Pennsylvania Republican, adding that he has a healthy humility about the Fed and its powers. Mr. Shelby said Mr. Powell's outreach to Congress was smart, noting that Alan Greenspan, when he was chairman, he did that. Mr. Powell, who is not an economist, is hardly seen as a master conductor in markets. New iPhones fuel strong profit from Apple. Sales of Apple's flagship product has fallen sharply for the past year, but on Tuesday, Apple said iPhone revenue was growing again. In the latest quarter, Apple debuted one of its biggest efforts to expand the service's business, Apple TV Plus, a package of exclusive TV shows produced by Apple that cost $5 a month, cheaper than most offerings from its rivals. Still, early market estimates suggests the service has not been a big draw for new paying subscribers over the first several months, in part because Apple is giving a free year subscription to the service to anyone who buys a new iPhone, iPad, Apple TV, or Mac computer. U.S. budget deficit to top $1 trillion for the next decade. The federal budget deficit already hit $1 trillion last year, the first calendar year since 2012 that the gap between revenue and spending topped the $1 trillion mark. We would then focus on paying off and refinancing debt. There is almost no inflation. This is the time. Donald J. Trump, January 28, 2020. Mr. Trump promised to pay off the national debt as president, but in 3 years in office, he has instead added to it with big tax cuts and increased federal spending. Every year we set a new post-war record for debt as a share of the economy. Every year the Congressional Budget Office warns that debt is rising unsustainably, and every year our largest trust fund gets closer to depleting their reserves. Ignoring what is staring us right in the face is fiscal malfeasance. Bitcoin has lost steam, but criminals still love it. The amount of cryptocurrency spent on so-called dark net markets, where stolen credit card information and a wide array of illegal drugs can be purchased with Bitcoin, rose 60% to reach a new height of $601 million in the last 3 months of 2009, according to data released Tuesday by Chain Analysis, a firm that tracks every Bitcoin transaction and serves as an advisor to an array of government authorities. Bitcoin advocates have generally been unconcerned about the amount of illegal activity done using Bitcoin because they see much larger amounts of illegal activity with traditional currencies, and because Bitcoin has significant drawbacks for criminals. One of the new black markets that have become popular over the last year, Empire Market, has several pages of listings for fentanyl in various forms, from 12 grams for $1,600 in Bitcoin to a patch for $41. Almost all the news sites have lengthy sections on why, even with the drawbacks of Bitcoin, they will remain the place to buy drugs online. Ben Smith of BuzzFeed named New York Times media columnist. Ben Smith, the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed, who built a hard-hitting news operation within a digital media organization, better known for clickbait and listicles, will be the New York Times' next media columnist. BuzzFeed hired Mr. Smith in 2012 as an editor-in-chief to help start its new division, BuzzFeed News. In January 2017, Mr. Smith had to defend BuzzFeed News after he was the first editor to publish an unverified dossier containing salacious reports about President Trump compiled by Christopher Steele, a former British intelligence officer, during the 2016 presidential campaign. Kobe Bryant's death and the pitfalls for big brands. Amid the tributes to Kobe Bryant on Sunday, dedications at the Grammy Awards, condolences from presidents, messages written on sneakers of NBA players, there's a Twitter post from the blockchain company Tron Foundation. The negative reaction suggested that companies must be tactful as they try to memorialize Mr. Bryant. Adidas, which sponsored Mr. Bryant when he was a teenager and produced shoes in his name, described him as a true legend. The body armor sports drink maker said Mr. Bryant, a significant investor in the company, was an incredible friend. McDonald's, which let a sponsorship deal with Mr. Bryant expire after he was accused of sexually assaulting a woman in 2003, posted a message honoring his greatness on a corporate Twitter account devoted to McDonald's All-American Games, a high school basketball tournament. Fort Worth embraces its cowboy culture. Dickies Arena, $540 million showcase adorned with towering murals depicting scenes from Texas frontier culture, is the new home of the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo, one of the world's oldest indoor rodeos. Dickies Arena, which bears the name of a Fort Worth workwear brand, is believed to be the only major arena built to anchor a rodeo, but able to host other events ranging from the March Madness basketball tournaments to ice shows. The arena's development opens up a whole new corridor of real estate activity for the cultural district of Fort Worth, said Brandon Gengelbach, president of the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce. Chipotle fined $1.4 million in vast child labor case, with the unemployment at 3.5%, its lowest level in decades. Chains across the United States are struggling to recruit low-wage workers, putting pressure on restaurant operators to break the rules, according to the employment lawyers and restaurant industry experts. The chain's chief corporate reputation officer, Lori Shalau, said in a statement on Tuesday that Chipotle was committed to ensuring that our restaurants are in full compliance with all laws and regulations. We believe that in hiring workers beginning at age 16, we can provide younger employees with valuable experience and provide a compelling work environment, Ms. Shalau said. A few factors specific to the restaurant industry have made the problem especially acute for fast food chains. The number of teenagers in workforce has steadily declined, and Wall Street investment has led to a glut of restaurant openings, oversaturating the market. And that has been Reading the Times for Thursday, January 29th, 2020.